Hello students. This video is on character voice, putting words in your characters' mouths and letting them speak. So when you're thinking about character voice, it's important to think about the way you want your reader to perceive each one of the people that you're writing about. Because the way that people talk affects the way that others react to them. So the way that I speak affects the way that you react to me. The way you speak affects the way that the people around you react to you. And the same thing is true for your characters. What they notice, their speech patterns, their word choices, how complicated their sentences are, all of these things are going to change how your reader responds to the characters. So this affects fiction in two extremely important ways. First, it affects the narration. So if you're dealing with a first person narrator, second or third person narrator, it's going to, thinking about character voice is going to change the way you write these things. And let's see if I can get out of the way here. It also is going to affect the dialogue, and it's going to affect the dialogue no matter what kind of narrative voice you use, if you are including characters speaking to one another. So the narrative voice in first person, when you're using I, like in Apollo, Sonny's Blues, and in Cathedral, which I have uploaded for you to read because it's a very good example. In first person, everything that the reader sees on the page is filtered through the character's voice. So what that means is that all of those word choices are going to come straight from the characters themselves. And that tells us a lot about the person. What they choose to emphasize, what they choose to share with the reader, all of that is going to tell us what we know about that person. So in Apollo and in Sonny's Blues, we deal with things that are happening to the narrator in the present day, in the now of the story, and we also deal with the way that the narrator thinks about things that happened in the past. In Apollo, we have our narrator looking back on themselves as a child and their actions then, and they're thinking about their actions then, and that might change the way we think about the narrator in the present of the story, in that first initial expository section. In Sonny's Blues, our narrator's memories don't go back to childhood, but they do go back many years to when he and Sonny were still speaking. He and his mother were still speaking. There is a memory of Sonny, but it's our narrator in the present day having a memory of Sonny taking his first steps. So that's not it. Now, one of the things that doesn't come up necessarily in Apollo and Sonny's Blues, but something that you do have to think about when using a first person narrator, is how much you want your readers to trust the character. So Cathedral is an example of this. Our narrator is just a total jerk, and the narrator says a lot of bad things or not very positive things about other people. But because it's a first person narration and they aren't hiding the fact that they're a jerk, we might trust this narrator more. In other situations, you might want to have a narrator who is lying to the reader, lying to themselves, lying to other people, and that can be interesting to deal with as well. In third person, which we see in Bullet in the Brain, which was one of the stories for this week, and in The Story of an Hour, which you'll be reading for next week. The third person can be neutral, so this can just be an impartial observer who is stating the facts of the case and telling you what happens. This is what we get in The Story of an Hour. Or it can have a character itself. It can have commentary on what is happening. And that's what we see in Bullet in the Brain. The narrative voice there passes judgment on Anders, talks about him in a way that's kind of judging, and that's not something you get from a neutral observer. So you have to think in the third person as well. What does your word choice, what do the things that you're saying, that you're sharing about the character, what does that do for the reader? How does that affect them? That third person voice might know more than the characters in both of these stories, Bolt in the Brain and The Story of an Hour. I think we have a little bit of an omniscient voice, which means all-knowing. And you also have to think about whether you want your third person to be close third person. So that means you get into the character's head, you know what they're thinking, or the narrator is like a camera that's sitting on their shoulder, seeing all the things that they can see, hearing all the things that they can hear, but not necessarily getting right in their head. A distant third person just is that neutral reporter, observes and reports, can still comment on things, doesn't have to be neutral, but is more often, if we're in a distant third. We don't know what the characters are thinking if we're using a distant point of view. There's also stuff like multiple close third person or moving close third person. If you've read the Game of Thrones books where every chapter is in a different character's head, that's multiple close third person. You can also do an omniscient narrator who can jump from head to head and tell you what everyone is thinking. You have to be careful with that because it can get confusing. Maybe stay away from that if it's your first time trying out third person, but those are things that you can try. Second person, where you're directly addressing the reader, you're saying, you did this, you thought this, you saw this, is very hard to do well because you are putting the reader in the role of a character who is taking these actions, seeing these things, thinking these things. And the reader might not be the type of person to do or notice or think the things that you want them to do or notice or think. And that means that the actions should probably be believable or relatable, or your reader is probably going to just push away the narrative. They're not going to feel comfortable in that. This isn't always the case. Some readers will go along with it. And in some cases, you might be able to put the reader in the role of a character who's doing terrible things, and they'll go along with it. But it does take a delicate touch. I wouldn't recommend it if you are not practiced in writing fiction. So the most important thing for you is that you feel comfortable or get comfortable writing in the voice that you choose. You get to know your character well, and you write something that flows for you. And I also want you to know that it's important for you to try things out and have fun in this. You aren't going to know if you like a voice until you try it out, and you aren't going to improve and push yourself and expand your abilities in fiction unless you're trying new things. So go ahead, remember there's no real harm in trying things out, and have fun with it. Okay, the next thing to think about with regards to voice is dialogue. When you're writing dialogue, so characters speaking to each other or speaking out loud for whatever reason, you have 4 goals. You can see them here. We're going to go through them one at a time. The first goal is to sound natural. It's important for your readers to believe that your characters would say the things that you're having them say in the way that you're having them say it. So there are some things to think about when you're thinking about sounding natural. The first is think about who they're talking to and remember what you know about your characters. So your characters probably speak differently when they're talking to someone like a teacher or a parent or a rabbi than they might speak to a friend or a sibling. And when you're thinking about what you know about your characters, think about what they are trying to get out of the situation. They're going to use different words, and they're going to say different things if they're trying to get a favor out of someone than if they're trying to collect a debt, for instance. Um, Another tip for sounding natural is to read your dialogue out loud. If it sounds awkward coming out of your mouth, or when you hear it in your ear and you imagine your character using it, then you should probably work on that line some more. And finally, on this point, it's important to remember that in some cases, your characters might sound unnatural or awkward. If they're uncomfortable in the situation for whatever reason, or if they're trying to sound smarter than they are or use jargon that they're not familiar with, they might sound uncomfortable, and that's okay. The next goal, after sounding natural, is advancing the plot. Your dialogue should move the plot forward, and this helps your reader feel that they aren't just treading water, they aren't moving anywhere, which means that you should skip the boring stuff by summarizing or ignoring it unless the point of the conversation is that things are boring. So when two characters run into each other, normally, if I meet someone on the street, I say, "Hey, how are you doing? What's up?" And we have a little bit of pleasantry exchange that is not super important to the plot of my life. Weird as that sounds. So in fiction, you would either skip it or summarize it really quickly, or just have one line so that the reader knows what's going on, that you didn't just walk up to someone and say, "Hey, where's my money?" You might have a character do that anyway. So you want to make sure that things are moving forward. And a really easy way to do this is to show or develop character in dialogue. So dialogue can be used to demonstrate some things that are not mentioned in the narrative. So you could imagine a conversation between an awkward person and their crush. If the audience doesn't know about the crush, then you can use dialogue to make this clear. You can use dialogue to show this. And this is a situation maybe where you might not want the dialogue to sound natural. If your character sounds really confident in other situations but suddenly sounds awkward and shy, that might clue the audience that something is happening. You could also use dialogue to develop what the audience already knows. If we know about the crush, the conversation can emphasize the fact that the crush exists and develop our understanding of the character. If we know that the character is awkward, then every time they speak, maybe that awkwardness comes through, and then maybe it's important that the character finds someone that they are comfortable speaking to, and we can see that, the reader can see that in the dialogue. So the next goal of dialogue is that it should have subtext. It should say more than it is saying. So you can think about this. The phrase "we need to talk" means different things depending on what the audience knows about the characters. So if one of your parents says to you, "we need to talk," that means something. If the person that you're dating says, "we need to talk," that means something different. But in both cases, it has subtext. You know that there's probably something not great going on. If you think about the conversation between the narrator and Sunny in Sunny's Blues, Sunny is repeating, "It can come again, it can come again, I want you to know it can come again." He's not talking about the darkness, this abstract thing. He's talking about his addiction. He's talking about his addiction to heroin in there. And that's subtext. It's not very buried very far. It's like pretty close to the surface, but still, that's an example of subtext. Often when you're trying to work in subtext, you can use what I call stage prompts here, or stage directions, to help. These are gestures or descriptions of things that are happening while the dialogue is going on, because people usually don't just stand perfectly still and speak at each other without using like facial expressions or gesturing a lot. So In Apollo, if you think about the scene where the narrator is putting eye drops in Raphael's eyes, all of the stage directions there, like Raphael tells the narrator not to come any closer. I went close. I forget the exact words, but we know that the narrator went closer. And this has meaning for the scene. It adds subtext to the rest of the things that happen. In Sonny's Blues, during that same conversation I was just mentioning, Sonny is crushing a beer can the whole time this conversation is going on. We see his internal struggle. We see how hard he's working to get these words out and how uncomfortable he is and how much pressure he feels through the fact of him crushing that beer can. So again, these are the 4 goals all up here at once, and you don't need to do all of these things every time you write a line of dialogue. These are just things to keep in mind. And the way that you approach and use dialogue is going to change depending on your goal for that particular scene. All right, let's talk a little bit about dialogue formatting. I have some examples here. And Jean here is explaining to Charles what's going on. So every time a new speaker is speaking or the speaker changes, you should start a new paragraph, including if the new speaker does something before speaking. So Charles tilted his head and squinted at her. This is a paragraph with a new speaker, so we start a new paragraph. Jean nodded. This is a new person reacting. And then we have a paragraph where Charles reacts to what Jean says, but then Jean's smile and her reaction to this is still the focus of the paragraph. So take a look at this and think about it. Pause the video if necessary, and think about what's going on there. We also have examples of using dialogue tags. So Jean said is what we call a dialogue tag. And when you're using this, said is the most common and probably the best dialogue tag that you're going to have access to. Yelled, screamed, whispered, those things are possible, but if you're going to use those, it should be obvious to the reader before they're yelling, screaming, whispering, whatever, that would be the right reaction. So you should start a new paragraph every time the speaker changes Jean yelled. Once the reader gets to the point where it says Jean yelled, they then have to rewrite that last line in their head. They have to rehear it because now at the end of it, they know that Jean is yelling instead of ahead of time. So you can put the dialogue tag ahead of time. Jean yelled at Charles. You should start a new paragraph every time the speaker changes. That's possible. All right. The second example here, we don't have a dialogue tag, but as a reader, we know who's speaking because Charles is the one who's acting in this paragraph, and he is named. Here we have an example of an internal tag. Some people, Jean said, will leave a character reaction in the same paragraph, etc. So where you're going to place the dialogue tag can add rhythm to the piece of dialogue. So try it out. Again, you should practice with these. Typically, when you're having a conversation, too fast. When you're having a conversation between two people, you don't need to have dialogue tags or names in every single paragraph when the speaker changes, because there are only two people. Your audience should be able to follow a few lines of back and forth, especially if it's clear who is doing what in the scene. If you have more than two people, use more dialogue tags. Even when you have two people, use dialogue tags frequently enough that your reader can stay grounded and knows who's saying what. But yeah, three people, more than three people, use dialogue tags, use a lot of action. And if you want examples of this, go back, look at Sonny's Blues, look at Apollo. Look at Bullet in the Brain. Take a look at Cathedral. There's a lot of dialogue in there. And you'll see a lot of examples. Look at whatever books you're reading for fun, and take a look at how the author uses dialogue tags. All right, so your writing exercise is posted to Blackboard. Here it is very briefly. I want you to write 3 different conversations, 3 different pieces of dialogue, or scenes of dialogue, with the character that you built up for your character sketch last week. Or you can make a new character, I don't care, as long as you know the character well enough to be able to hear them, to know what they sound like and know how they would interact with these people. So asking someone they know very well for money, this can be a friend, a parent, a teacher, whatever, someone that they know really well, asking them for money. Next, I want a scene of dialogue where they are admitting a mistake to someone that they respect very much, so someone whose opinion of them they value. And then finally, I want you to write a scene of dialogue where they are lying to a complete stranger. So in each of these cases, because motivation, because a character's desire, what they want to get out of a conversation, is important for how you write that conversation, you are going to have to think of why a character would need money and how much money they need and what they're going to use it for and what they're going to tell the person that they're asking for money about why they need the money. Stuff like that. So you are going to have to build up each of these scenes. Should be a lot of fun. All right, that is it for this video. As always, let me know if you have any questions.